What if the house you just moved into had been waiting for you? Today, I'm sharing 3 documented cases where ordinary families discovered their dream homes were built on nightmares. These aren't urban legends. These are real families, real addresses, and real terror that lasted for years. What you're about to hear has been verified through police reports, witness testimonies, and families who still bear the scars of what they experienced. Before we begin, I need to warn you, these stories contain details that some viewers may find deeply disturbing, but they're all true. Let's begin. In the winter of 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perron were living the American dream. Roger worked as a truck driver. Carolyn was a devoted mother to their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April. The girls ranged from 5 to 12 years old. They'd been searching for the perfect home for months, something big enough for their growing family, somewhere peaceful where the girls could grow up surrounded by nature. When they found the farmhouse on Round Top Road in Harrisville, Rhode Island, it felt like fate. The house was built in 1736, a massive colonial structure with 8 rooms, sitting on 200 acres of rolling farmland. The property had ancient oak trees, a barn, and that rare kind of silence you only find deep in the countryside. The price was surprisingly affordable, almost suspiciously affordable. But Roger and Carolyn were practical people. They didn't believe in looking gift horses in the mouth. They signed the papers in December and moved in on a cold January morning in 1971. The first night was quiet, too quiet, Carolyn would later recall. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. The girls were excited, running through the halls, picking out their rooms. April, the youngest, chose a small bedroom on the 2nd floor. She loved it immediately, until the sun went down. That first night, April refused to sleep alone. She stood in her parents' doorway at midnight, trembling, saying that someone was watching her. Not something, someone, a woman, standing in the corner of her room, just staring. Carolyn walked her back to bed, checked the closet, looked under the bed. Nothing there, just shadows and old wood creaking in the winter wind. She tucked April in, kissed her forehead, and promised her everything was fine. But April knew what she'd seen, and she'd see it again, every single night for the next 9 years. It started in the kitchen. Carolyn was making breakfast when she smelled at something rotting. Not trash, not old food, flesh, the unmistakable stench of decaying meat. She checked the garbage, the cabinets, behind the refrigerator. Nothing. The smell would come and go randomly. Sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the girls' bedrooms, sometimes in the basement. But here's what made it disturbing. It never appeared in the same place twice in one day. It moved through the house like something walking from room to room. Roger dismissed it. Old houses smell weird, he said. Probably something dead in the walls, a rat, maybe a raccoon. They'd find it eventually. But weeks passed, and they never did. The smell just persisted, and the girls started noticing patterns. It appeared most often at 3:15 a.m. Christine, the middle daughter, started keeping a journal. She'd wake up to the smell, write down the time. Over and over. 3:15 a.m. Sometimes 3:14, sometimes 3:16, but always around that exact moment, like clockwork. Late January, the knocking started. Roger was in bed when he heard it, 3 deliberate knocks from inside the wall behind his headboard. He sat up, listened. Silence. Then again, knock, 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 pause. Knock, knock, knock. He got up, checked the hallway. Nothing. The girls were asleep. He went back to bed. The knocking continued now from a different wall, the one facing the hallway. He put his hand against the plaster. The knocking moved to the wall on the opposite side of the room. It was playing with him. Over the next few weeks, every family member experienced it. The knocking would follow them from room to room. Sometimes it responded to them. Andrea tested it one night. She knocked twice on her bedroom wall. The wall knocked back. Twice, she knocked 4 times. 4 knocks answered her. She never tested it again. March 1971. Carolyn woke up with pain in her neck. When she looked in the mirror, she saw them 5 distinct marks, like fingerprints, wrapping around her throat. Dark purple bruises, perfectly spaced, the pattern of a hand. She hadn't hit anything. Roger hadn't grabbed her. They appeared overnight, while she slept. It happened again 3 days later, and again the following week, sometimes on her neck, sometimes on her arms. Once, she found scratches on her back, 3 long parallel lines, like something with claws had dragged down her spine while she lay unconscious. The girls started showing marks too. Nancy found bruises on her legs, perfectly circular, like someone had grabbed her ankles. Christine woke up with a handprint on her shoulder, small fingers, like a child's hand, but pressed so hard, it left a bruise that lasted 2 weeks. The family doctor examined them. He had no explanation. The marks didn't match any known medical condition. They weren't self-inflicted. They just appeared. The basement was always the worst part of the house. Even on bright summer days, it felt wrong down there. The temperature would drop 20 degrees the moment you reached the bottom of the stairs. The girls refused to go down alone. Even Roger, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, felt uncomfortable in that space. In June, Andrea dropped a flashlight and watched it roll into the far corner of the basement, the area behind the old furnace where the stone foundation was exposed. She went to retrieve it. That's when she saw them. Scratches in the stone. Hundreds of them. Long, deliberate marks carved into the rock, clustered in the darkest corner. Some of them looked like words, but the language was wrong. Not English. Not anything she recognized. She grabbed the flashlight and ran upstairs. When Roger went down to investigate, he found something else. A smell. That same rotting flesh smell, but concentrated in that corner. So strong it made him gag. He spent the next day sealing off that section of the basement with plywood. The knocking got worse after that. Almost angry. By their first anniversary in the house, all 5 daughters had seen her, the woman. They'd each seen her independently, without knowing the others had too. When they finally compared notes, the descriptions matched perfectly. A woman in her 50s, wearing a long gray dress that looked like it was from the 1800s. Her hair was pulled back severely. Her face was gaunt, angular, with eyes that looked almost black in the darkness. She never spoke, never moved, just stood and watched. April saw her most often standing in the corner of her bedroom, arms at her sides, staring at the bed. Nancy saw her in the hallway mirror, standing behind her when no one was there. Christine saw her in the kitchen at dawn, standing by the window, silhouetted against the rising sun. But the worst sighting belonged to Carolyn. She was in bed one night when she felt watched. She opened her eyes, and the woman was there standing at the foot of the bed, inches away, leaning forward, face mere feet from Carolyn's. Her expression was pure hatred. Her mouth moved like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Carolyn couldn't move, couldn't scream. She was paralyzed with terror. The apparition lasted maybe 10 seconds, then the woman simply faded, like smoke dissipating in wind. Carolyn didn't sleep for 3 days after that. By 1972, the Perrons were desperate. They'd tried everything: priests, blessings, burning sage, prayer groups. Nothing worked. The activity only intensified. Roger was being scratched in his sleep. Objects were moving on their own. Doors would slam so hard, they'd crack the frames. That's when someone recommended Ed and Lorraine Warren, paranormal investigators from Connecticut, who'd handled cases like this before. The Perrons were skeptical, but they were also out of options. Ed and Lorraine arrived in spring of 1972. Lorraine claimed to be clairvoyant, sensitive to spiritual energy. The moment she entered the house, she stopped in the doorway of the living room. Her face went pale. She turned to Carolyn and said, "There are 9 spirits in this house. 8 of them are harmless, but one of them is evil, and it's attached to you." She was pointing at Carolyn. Lorraine explained that the primary entity was a woman named Bathsheba Sherman. She'd lived in the house in the 1800s. Lorraine claimed Bathsheba had been a Satanist, that she'd sacrificed her own infant child to the devil, drove a knitting needle through the base of the baby's skull. She was suspected of the murder, but never convicted. After her death, her spirit remained, violently possessive of the house and hostile toward any woman who lived there. The Warrens documented everything. They took photographs, many of which showed strange orbs and shadows that couldn't be explained. They recorded audio knocking sounds, whispers, and once, a voice that said, "Get out," so clearly it made Ed physically flinch. But when they suggested performing a seance to communicate with Bathsheba, Carolyn refused. She'd seen what this thing was capable of. She wasn't about to invite it to speak. 1975. The Warrens convinced Carolyn to allow a seance, just one. They'd bring in other mediums, create a protective circle, and attempt to communicate with Bathsheba to understand what she wanted. Carolyn agreed, against her better judgment. They held the seance in the living room. 6 people sat in a circle: Ed, Lorraine, Carolyn, and 3 other mediums. They dimmed the lights, held hands, and Lorraine began speaking, calling out to the spirits in the house. The temperature dropped immediately, breath visible in the air. The knocking started frantic, violent, coming from every wall simultaneously. One of the mediums started crying, saying she felt overwhelming rage and hatred directed at Carolyn. Then Carolyn started convulsing. Her body jerked backward, her eyes rolled back, and she began speaking in a voice that wasn't hers, a low, guttural voice that said things in a language none of them recognized. Ed tried to break the circle, but Carolyn's hand gripped his so tightly his fingers bruised. Lorraine began praying loudly, invoking protection, demanding the spirit release Carolyn. The lights flickered. Objects fell from shelves. Then, suddenly, Carolyn went limp. When she came to, she had no memory of what happened, but she had a new mark, a perfect burn on her leg in the shape of a hand. The skin was blistered, 2nd degree, like someone had pressed a red-hot iron against her calf. The Warrens left that night. They told the Perrons the truth. They couldn't help them. The entity was too strong, too attached. The only solution was to leave the house. But the Perrons had no money to move. They were trapped. The family stayed in that house for 4 more years. They learned to live with it. They'd acknowledge the spirits, speak to them kindly, try to coexist peacefully. Some of the spirits were benign children, former residents who died naturally. Those were manageable. But Bathsheba never relented. Carolyn was hospitalized twice for injuries that doctors couldn't explain. Once for internal bleeding with no source. Once for a seizure that left her unconscious for 2 days. The girls grew up traumatized. Andrea started having nightmares so severe she'd wake up screaming. Nancy developed anxiety so bad she couldn't be alone in any room. April, the youngest, would later admit that she considered burning the house down just to make it stop. In January of 1989, years to the month after they'd moved in, the Perrons finally left. They'd saved enough money to move into a small apartment in town. The day they loaded the moving truck, Carolyn stood in the doorway and looked back at the house one final time. She swears she saw her, Bathsheba, standing in the upstairs window, watching them leave. Andrea Perron would later write 3 books about their experience: House of Darkness, House of Light. The family did interviews, appeared in documentaries. They were consistent in their story, never changing details, never exaggerating for effect. The house still stands today on Round Top Road. It's been sold multiple times. Some families report nothing, others leave within months. The current owners give tours to paranormal enthusiasts. But here's the disturbing part. In 2022, a family who'd bought the house reported that objects were moving again. The smell had returned, and their young daughter claimed a woman in a gray dress stood in her room every night. Same corner, same dress, same empty, hateful stare. Bathsheba is still there, still waiting, still watching. Jack and Janet Smurl were high school sweethearts. They married young, started a family, and by 1973, they had 2 daughters, Dawn and Heather. They wanted stability, a place to raise their kids surrounded by family. So when a duplex went up for sale on Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The plan was simple. Jack and Janet would live on one side. Jack's parents, John and Mary Smurl, would live on the other. 2 families, 1 building, shared walls but separate lives. Safety in numbers, built-in babysitters. The American dream, split into 2 halves. They bought the house in August 1973 and moved in with excitement and hope. For the first year, everything was perfect. In early 1974, both families noticed something strange. Cracks appearing in the foundation. Not normal settling cracks. These were large, jagged fractures that seemed to spread overnight. Jack called in a contractor. The contractor examined the basement, tested the concrete, and scratched his head. The foundation was solid. There was no structural reason for these cracks to exist, but they kept appearing, spiderwebbing across the walls, deeper and wider each week. Then the water damage started. Stains appeared on the walls, brown and damp, even though there were no leaking pipes. The smell came next, mildew and rot, concentrated in certain rooms. Jack's father, John, started complaining about cold spots in the house, specific areas where the temperature would drop suddenly, even in summer. Still, they were practical people. Old houses have problems. You fix them and move on. But their German shepherd, Simon, knew better. Simon had always been a calm, friendly dog, but he started acting strange. He'd stand at the top of the basement stairs, hackles raised, growling at nothing. He refused to go down those stairs. If you tried to force him, he'd dig his claws into the floor and whimper. Once, Jack dragged him halfway down. Simon snapped, nearly bit him. The only time that dog had ever shown aggression. Jack never tried again. For over a decade, the families lived with minor oddities, footsteps in empty rooms, doors closing on their own, objects moving slightly from where they'd been left. Strange, but manageable. They'd joke about it. The house is settling. The ghost is reorganizing again. But in 1985, everything changed. It started with Dawn and Heather, now teenagers. They began sleepwalking, something neither of them had ever done before. But here's what made it disturbing. They sleepwalked together. Janet would wake up at 2 a.m. and hear whispers in the hallway. She'd open her bedroom door and find both daughters standing there, facing each other, whispering in a language that didn't sound like English. Their eyes were open but unfocused, like they were looking through each other. When Janet would snap them out of it, they'd have no memory of leaving their beds, no memory of what they'd said. They'd just wake up confused, standing in the dark hallway in their nightgowns, wondering how they got there. It happened 3 times a week, then 5 times, then every single night. Jack set up a baby monitor in the hallway to figure out what they were saying. When he played back the recording the next morning, the whispers were there, but underneath them was another sound. A low, rhythmic breathing, heavy, wet, like something massive was standing in the hallway with them. He smashed the baby monitor and never mentioned it to Janet. Janet woke up at 3:30 a.m. because she couldn't breathe. There was pressure on her chest, immense weight, like someone sitting on her rib cage. She tried to move her arms, couldn't, tried to scream, nothing came out. She was completely paralyzed. Then she saw it. A shadow. Not a shadow cast by something, but a shadow that existed on its own. A massive, human-shaped darkness, standing beside the bed. 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Shoulders too broad, arms too long. It was leaning over her, and she could feel it looking at her, even though it had no face. The pressure increased. Her vision started to blur. She thought she was dying. Then, suddenly, it released her. She gasped, sucked in air, rolled over, coughing. Jack woke up, asked what was wrong. She tried to explain, but the words sounded insane even to her own ears. A shadow attacked her. A thing made of darkness held her down. Jack checked the bedroom. Nothing there. He held her until she fell back asleep. But when morning came, she lifted her shirt to get dressed and saw them. 4 long scratch marks across her torso. Deep, red, like claws had raked across her skin. She hadn't scratched herself. The marks were on her back, in places she couldn't reach. Something had touched her. Something real. Jack was a skeptic. Even after Janet's experience, he chalked it up to sleep paralysis, maybe a nightmare. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in demons. That changed one night in March. He was lying in bed, awake, when he felt hands grab his ankles. Cold hands, strong. Before he could react, he was yanked hard and dragged off the bed onto the floor. He hit the hardwood with his shoulder, pain shooting through his arm. He scrambled to his feet, turned on the light. Nobody there. Janet was asleep. The door was closed. But his ankles were red. Finger-shaped marks. Like someone had gripped them with inhuman strength. It happened again 2 nights later, and again the following week. Always at night. Always when he was just falling asleep. Invisible hands grabbing him, dragging him, sometimes pulling him halfway across the room before releasing him. One night, it got worse. He was dragged off the bed and pulled toward the bedroom door. He clawed at the floor, trying to stop himself, but the grip was too strong. The door opened on its own. He watched the handle turn, and he was dragged into the hallway. He screamed for Janet. She woke up, saw him being pulled away, and grabbed his arms. They had a tug of war, Janet pulling him back, something invisible pulling him forward. She was screaming, crying, holding on to him with everything she had. Then whatever had him let go. Jack collapsed into Janet's arms, shaking. His ankles were bruised purple, 4 distinct handprints. That's when they knew. This wasn't in their heads. This was real. Jack's parents, John and Mary, were experiencing things too. Objects moving in their side of the duplex, voices whispering their names. The smell of sulfur appearing randomly, so strong it made them gag. But they kept quiet. They didn't want to scare Jack and Janet, didn't want to seem crazy. Then one night, John witnessed something that broke his silence. He was in bed when he heard Jack screaming from the other side of the wall, screaming like he was being murdered. John ran over, burst through the front door, and found Janet in the hallway, hysterical, pointing at the bedroom. John walked in and saw Jack floating 3 feet off the bed, suspended in midair, body rigid, arms at his sides. His eyes were rolled back, only white showing. His mouth was open, and a voice was coming out of him, deep, guttural, wrong. It wasn't speaking English. It wasn't speaking any language John recognized. Just sounds, guttural, wet sounds that made John's skin crawl. Janet was sobbing, begging for it to stop. John started praying the Lord's Prayer, the only thing he could remember. As he prayed, Jack's body lowered slowly back to the bed. When his back touched the mattress, Jack gasped. His eyes rolled forward, and he woke up. He had no memory of it, no memory of floating, of speaking, of anything. But John never forgot the way Jack's body moved, not like he was being lifted, but like gravity had just stopped affecting him. The attacks intensified. Objects flew across rooms. Dishes smashed against walls with no one near them. The daughters were pushed down the stairs, physically shoved by invisible hands. Janet was dragged out of bed by her hair, screaming as clumps came out in whatever was gripping her. The smell of decay became constant, unbearable, like something dead had been sealed inside the walls and was slowly rotting. Desperate, the family reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the same couple who'd investigated the Perron house. The Warrens arrived, examined the duplex, and declared it one of the most severe cases they'd ever seen. They brought in priests, performed blessings, even attempted an exorcism. The activity stopped briefly days, maybe a week, then came back stronger than before, almost like whatever was there had been provoked. In August 1986, the Smurls went public. They held a press conference, desperate for help. They appeared on local news, then national news. Reporters camped outside their house. Paranormal investigators from around the country came to study the property. And here's where things got strange. When cameras were set up, when investigators were present with equipment, the activity stopped completely. Nothing happened. But the moment everyone left, the moment the cameras were turned off, it started again, worse than before. Skeptics called it a hoax, said the family was making it up for attention, but the Smurls weren't profiting from this. They were being harassed, ridiculed, called liars on national television. They had no reason to fabricate this nightmare. By 1988, the family was shattered. Jack had developed severe anxiety. Janet was on medication for trauma. The daughters wouldn't come home from school unless both parents were there. John and Mary had stopped sleeping through the night. One night in August, Janet was attacked so severely that Jack called an ambulance. She'd been scratched across her face, 3 deep claw marks from forehead to chin, narrowly missing her eye. The paramedics who arrived were disturbed. They'd never seen injuries like this. No weapon could have made those marks. They looked like something with talons had swiped her face. That was the final straw. The family moved out. They held a public statement, told their story one last time, and left the duplex forever. Here's the part that still haunts investigators. New families moved into the duplex after the Smurls left. Multiple families. Over the years, none of them reported anything unusual. No footsteps, no attacks, no shadows. The house was completely normal. Whatever had tormented the Smurls, it was specific to them. It targeted that family, and only that family. In 1991, the house was torn down. The property was redeveloped. But people in West Pittston still talk about the Smurl house. They remember the news vans, the chaos, the family that was driven out by something no one could see. Jack and Janet eventually divorced. The trauma broke their marriage. Don and Heather both moved across the country, cutting ties with Pennsylvania entirely. They don't give interviews. They don't talk about what happened. Jack Smurl passed away in 2019. Before his death, he gave one final interview. The interviewer asked him if he still believed what happened was real. Jack looked directly at the camera and said, "I have the scars. My daughters have the scars. You can believe what you want, but I know what touched me in that house, and I know it wasn't human." If these stories are keeping you hooked, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. I spend weeks researching each case, tracking down original documents, interviewing people connected to these events. Your support helps me keep bringing you the darkest, most verified horror content on YouTube. And don't forget to drop a like on this video. It tells me you want more stories like this. Trust me, this final case is the one that will truly haunt you. Now, let's talk about the funeral home. In 1986, Carmen and Al Snedeker were facing a crisis. Their eldest son, Philip, had been diagnosed with cancer, Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was only 15 years old. The treatment plan required intensive chemotherapy at a hospital in Connecticut, hours away from their home in upstate New York. The family had no choice. They had to move closer to the hospital. But they had 3 other children, 2 sons and a daughter, and almost no money. Finding affordable housing big enough for a family of 6 in Connecticut seemed impossible. Then they found the house on Meriden Avenue in Southington. It was perfect, spacious, rent was unbelievably cheap, and it was only minutes from the hospital. The landlord explained that it had been vacant for a while, which was why the price was so low. Carmen and Al didn't ask too many questions. They couldn't afford to be picky. They signed the lease and moved in June of 1986. It wasn't until they started unpacking that Carmen went down to the basement and realized this wasn't just a house. It was a former funeral home. The basement was massive, far larger than the upstairs would suggest. It was divided into several rooms, each with a specific purpose. One room had deep sinks with industrial drains. Another had metal tables bolted to the floor. A third had cabinets filled with strange instruments, tubes, clamps, tools Carmen couldn't identify. The landlord had failed to mention this detail. Carmen felt uneasy, but they were already moved in, and they needed the space. Philip was going through aggressive chemotherapy. He needed his own room to rest and recover. The basement had 2 bedrooms, so Carmen decided Philip and his younger brother, Brad, would sleep downstairs. Philip hated it immediately. He told Carmen the basement felt wrong, too cold, too quiet. He'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was standing over him, watching him sleep. Carmen dismissed it. Philip was on heavy medication, dealing with cancer and chemo. It made sense that he'd have strange thoughts, paranoia. But then Brad started complaining too. Brad was 13 years old, skeptical, not prone to imagination. But he told Carmen he kept seeing people in the basement, not shadows, people. Figures wearing old-fashioned clothing, standing motionless in the corners of the room. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and see them, a man in a suit, a woman in a long dress, sometimes children. They never moved, never spoke, just stood there, staring at him. When he'd turn on the light, they'd still be there, for a few seconds. Then, they'd fade, like they were dissolving into the air. Philip saw them too, more frequently than Brad. He described them the same way. Silent figures, dressed like they were from the 1800s or early 1900s, appearing mostly at night, but sometimes during the day. One afternoon, Philip was lying on his bed when he saw a man standing at the foot of the bed. The man was wearing a black suit, arms at his sides, face expressionless. Philip stared at him. The man stared back. Neither moved for what felt like minutes. Then Philip blinked, and the man was gone. A week after moving in, Brad was exploring the basement, opening drawers, checking cabinets, being a curious kid. That's when he found them. Hidden in a drawer in one of the back rooms, embalming tools, surgical instruments, long needles, scalpels, metal tubes, clamps, wrapped in old cloth, like someone had hidden them decades ago and forgotten. Some of them were stained, brownish red residue, dried and cracked. Brad showed Carmen. She stared at the tools, feeling her stomach twist. She threw them away immediately, taking them out to the street trash so they wouldn't be in the house. That night, the knocking started. It wasn't random knocking, it was purposeful. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the basement floor. The entire house seemed to vibrate with it. The knocking happened every night, always starting at 2 a.m., always 3 knocks, repeated endlessly until sunrise. Carmen and Al tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, the house settling, but the knocking was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It didn't sound mechanical. It sounded like someone was trying to get their attention. Then the whispers began. Philip heard them first. He'd be lying in bed and hear voices soft, layered, like multiple people whispering at once. He couldn't make out words, just the sound of urgent, overlapping whispers. They seemed to come from the floor drains in the basement bathroom. Brad heard them too. He'd be brushing his teeth and hear voices rising from the drain. He'd lean down, try to listen, but the moment he got close, the whispers would stop. One night, he pressed his ear to the drain and heard something that made his blood run cold. His own name, whispered, over and over. Brad, Brad, Brad. He ran upstairs and refused to go back down. Philip started changing, not physically, emotionally, psychologically. He became angry, aggressive, paranoid. He'd snap at his family for no reason, throw things, punch walls. This wasn't like him. Even accounting for the stress of chemotherapy, his behavior was extreme. He stopped sleeping. He'd stay awake all night, pacing the basement, talking to himself. Carmen would hear him through the floor, arguing with someone, having full conversations with a person who wasn't there. When she confronted him, he'd have no memory of it. One morning, Al found Philip standing in the basement at 4 a.m., facing the wall, completely still. Al called his name. No response. He walked over, put a hand on Philip's shoulder. Philip spun around, his eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated, face blank. "They want me to stay," Philip said. "They said I belong here." Then he blinked, and it was like he snapped back. "Dad, what are you doing down here?" He had no memory of saying those words. Carmen started noticing something disturbing when she walked past mirrors in the house. Sometimes her reflection was wrong. Not drastically, just off. The reflection would move a half second too late. Or it would be standing slightly different than she was. Once, she saw her reflection smile at her when she wasn't smiling. She stopped looking in mirrors. But the worst incident happened one afternoon when she was alone in the house. She walked past the bathroom mirror and saw someone else's reflection, not her face, a woman. Older, thin, with sunken eyes and gray skin. The woman was staring back at her from inside the mirror. Carmen screamed, stumbled backward. When she looked again, her own reflection was there, normal, just her. She told Al. He didn't believe her, told her she was stressed, imagining things. But then he saw it too. The smell of formaldehyde started appearing randomly throughout the house. That sharp chemical smell that's unmistakable if you've ever been in a morgue or a biology lab. It would appear in the kitchen, the living room, the kids' bedrooms. It was so strong that it would make them gag. Carmen would open all the windows, trying to air out the house, but the smell would linger for hours. The worst part? It was strongest in Philip's room. Philip started complaining that he could taste it, that it was in his mouth, his throat. He'd wake up gagging, convinced someone had poured chemicals down his throat while he slept. Carmen took him to the doctor. The doctor found nothing wrong. By late 1987, the family was desperate. Philip's health was declining not just from the cancer, but from the lack of sleep, the stress, the psychological torment. Carmen reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the same paranormal investigators who'd worked the Perron and Smurl cases. The Warrens investigated the property and discovered something horrifying. The funeral home's previous director had been investigated in the 1,970 seconds for necromancy, desecration of corpses during occult rituals. The case was never proven. The director left town abruptly, and the building was sold. But local records showed that several families had complained about the funeral home before it closed. Reports of strange sounds at night, lights in the basement when the building should have been empty, and disturbing smells that neighbors couldn't identify. The Warrens believed that whatever rituals had been performed in that basement had left a permanent mark. The line between the living and the dead had been crossed too many times in that space. And now, the Snedeker family was living on top of it. Lorraine warned Carmen specifically about Philip. She said the spirits were drawn to him because he was sick, vulnerable. They saw him as one of them, someone close to death. They wanted to keep him there. The Warrens arranged for a priest to come and perform a blessing of the house. Father Robert McKenna arrived on a cold December evening in 1987. He brought holy water, blessed candles, and the resolve to cleanse this place. The moment he entered the basement, he stopped. He told Carmen later that he felt an overwhelming sense of hatred coming from that space. Like the house itself was angry that he was there. He began the blessing anyway, moving through each room, reciting prayers, sprinkling holy water. When he reached Philip's bedroom, the temperature dropped so fast that his breath became visible. The candle he was holding flickered, then went out even though there was no wind, no draft. He relit it and continued praying. That's when the door slammed shut. The priest was trapped in the room. He tried the handle locked from the outside, even though there was no lock on that door. He pounded on it, called for Carmen. She tried to open it from her side. The door wouldn't budge. For 10 minutes, Father McKenna was locked in that room. They could hear him praying loudly, voice desperate. Then, suddenly, the door swung open on its own. The priest stumbled out, pale and shaking. He had deep scratches on his arms, 3 parallel lines, like something had clawed him. He told Carmen he wouldn't come back, that whatever was in that house was beyond his ability to help. He left and never returned their calls. Philip started having blackouts. He'd lose time hours at a stretch where he'd have no memory of what he'd done or where he'd been. Carmen would find him in strange places. Once, he was standing in the backyard at 3 a.m. in freezing weather, barefoot, staring at the house. When she woke him, he had no idea how he got there. Another time, Al found him in the basement, standing in the old embalming room, hands pressed against the wall, whispering in a language that sounded like Latin but wasn't quite right. The family started to fear Philip, not because they didn't love him, but because they didn't know what he might do when he wasn't himself. One night, Brad woke up to find Philip standing over his bed, staring down at him with empty eyes. Brad froze, too terrified to move. Philip stood there for what felt like an eternity, then turned and walked away without saying a word. Brad slept with his door locked after that. In March of 1988, Carmen had the worst experience of her life. She was alone in the house during the day, the kids at school, Al at work. She was doing laundry in the basement when she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. She turned around. No one there. The footsteps continued, moving around her in a circle. She could hear them clearly, the sound of shoes on concrete, but she was completely alone. Then she felt hands on her shoulders, cold, strong hands. They shoved her hard and she fell forward, hitting the concrete floor face first. Pain exploded in her nose. Blood poured from her nostrils. She scrambled to her feet, ran for the stairs. Something grabbed her ankle. She kicked, broke free, and sprinted up the stairs. When she looked back, she saw it. A shadow figure, standing at the bottom of the stairs. Man-shaped, massive. It didn't follow her, just stood there, watching her run. She grabbed her keys and left the house. She didn't come back until Al was home. That night, she told him everything. All the things she'd been holding back, the mirrors, the figures, the voices, the attacks. She begged him to leave. Al didn't want to. They'd signed a lease. They had nowhere else to go. Philip's treatment wasn't finished. But Carmen gave him an ultimatum. We leave, or I take the kids and leave without you. They decided to move out at the end of the month. They found a small apartment closer to the hospital, packed their belongings, and prepared to leave the house on Meriden Avenue forever. The last night they spent in that house, Philip had a breakdown. He woke up screaming at 2 a.m., sobbing uncontrollably. Carmen and Al ran to his room. He was sitting up in bed, shaking, tears streaming down his face. They're angry, he kept saying. They're so angry we're leaving. They said I promised to stay. They said I belong to them now. Carmen held him, trying to calm him down. But Philip grabbed her arms, looked her dead in the eyes, and said in a voice that wasn't his own, "You can take him, but he'll always belong to us. We'll be waiting." Then he collapsed, unconscious. Al carried him to the car. They loaded what they could and drove away that night, leaving most of their belongings behind. They never went back. The Snedeker family tried to rebuild their lives. Philip finished his chemotherapy and, miraculously, went into remission. But he was never the same. He suffered from severe PTSD, night terrors, and paranoia for years. He was institutionalized twice for violent outbursts and dissociative episodes. He'd claimed that he could still hear the voices, that they followed him from the house. Carmen and Al's marriage didn't survive. The trauma fractured their relationship. They divorced in 1991. The house on Meriden Avenue was investigated by multiple paranormal teams after the Snedekers went public with their story. Some claimed to capture EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, including whispers that said "stay in mine." But here's where the story gets controversial. Ray Garton, the author hired to write the family's story in the book In a Dark Place, later admitted in interviews that he was pressured by the Warrens to exaggerate and fabricate elements of the story to make it more marketable. He claimed the family's accounts were inconsistent, that Ed Warren told him to make it scary and not worry about the truth. This led skeptics to dismiss the entire case as a hoax, a fabricated story designed to make money off of tragedy and fear. But here's what skeptics can't explain. The medical records. Philip's doctors documented his psychological decline during the time they lived in that house. His behavior changed drastically, in ways that couldn't be explained by chemotherapy alone. The physical evidence. Photographs show the scratches on Carmen, the marks on the priest's arms, the bruises on the family members, and the other tenants. Before the Snedekers moved in, at least 2 other families had lived in that house briefly, both left within months. One family later admitted in a local newspaper that they'd experienced disturbing events, but didn't want to elaborate. The funeral home was renovated in the 1990 seconds. The basement was sealed off entirely, walls were built, access was blocked. The current owners don't advertise the history. In fact, real estate agents are careful not to mention what the building used to be. But neighbors remember, and they talk. In 2019, a Reddit user posted in a Connecticut forum, asking if anyone knew about the old funeral home in Southington. They said they'd recently moved into an apartment nearby and kept seeing lights in the basement windows of the house, warm, flickering lights, like candles. But the basement had been sealed. No one should be able to access it, and the current owners insist the basement has no electricity. Other neighbors confirmed it in the comments. They'd seen the lights too, always at night, always between 2 and 3 a.m. One commenter said they'd walked past the house late one night and heard something that made them run, whispering. Dozens of voices, whispering simultaneously, coming from the sealed basement. The post was deleted a week later. The original poster never explained why. Philip Snedeker rarely speaks about what happened in that house. He's now in his 50s, lives a quiet life, and has tried to distance himself from the story. But in 2011, a documentary filmmaker convinced him to do one interview. Near the end, the filmmaker asked him, "Do you think what happened in that house was real? Or do you think it was the stress, the medication, the illness?" Philip was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know what I saw. I know what touched me. I know the voices I heard weren't in my head. And I know that whatever was in that basement, it's still there. It never left. It's just waiting for the next family, the next sick kid, the next person weak enough for it to grab onto." He paused, staring directly into the camera. And if you ever find yourself living in a place that used to be a funeral home, get out. Don't wait. Don't try to rationalize it. Just get out. Because some places aren't meant for the living. The interview ended there. 3 families, 3 houses, 3 documented cases that defy rational explanation. The Perrons fought a spirit that claimed ownership of their home and tortured them for nearly a decade, a woman who died over a century ago but refuses to leave. The Smurls were hunted by something that chose them specifically, attacking them with increasing violence until they fled in terror, and whatever it was, it never touched another family again.